Good morning. Good morning. Hello. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I want to welcome you to day 2 of our Hannah Arendt Center conference, Crises of Democracy, Thinking in Dark Times. It's really exciting. We had our first conference 11 years ago, 2006, called Thinking in Dark Times, Hannah Arendt on Ethics and Politics. The center has grown, and I want to thank you all for being part of it and continuing to join us every year. We have an extremely exciting day of speakers for you, and also one that where we had a great breakout session at 8:30 this morning. So for all of you who came at 8:30, thank you very much. Give yourself a hand. There's going to be breakout sessions over lunch as well, and I encourage you to go to participate in that. Also, for those of you who are in the Hannah Arendt virtual reading group, which is a wonderful and hearty a band of people who get together every other week and read Hannah Arendt online from all over the world. And a bunch of you are here today. And Harold Bush, wherever he is, right there in the back, was looking to meet up with you because you sort of hang out on computer screens. And there was a thought that maybe some of you would get together and have a bite to eat later. So if you're interested and you're part of the virtual reading group, please go see Harold. He's sitting way in the back there, third row from the back. Raise your hand again, Harold. Stand up. Okay. We're going to move on and begin this, what I consider to be an extraordinary day. We're going to begin with an introduction by one of my dearest friends, but also someone I have about as much respect for intellectually and academically as one can have. He's been doing this, giving the introduction to the second day of the conference now for the last two or three years, and it's always an extraordinary wrap up and push forward of where we've been and going. Uday Mehta is a distinguished professor at CUNY University in New York. His book, Liberalism and Empire, is a book I recommend to students as the best book on liberalism I know of. So there's my recommendation. He has a new book coming out, A Different Vision, Gandhi's Critique of Political Rationality. Is that about right? It will be out very soon. And one of the things that, for those of you who've been coming to the conference for the last couple of years and heard him speak, in his readings of Gandhi, you'll see how extraordinarily rich they are on their own and how incredibly they interact with and help make sense of and push Hannah Arendt's own thinking. It's actually remarkable how many similarities and ways and friendships there are between Arendt and Gandhi. And a lot of that actually will get explored next year in our conference, which is going to be on civil disobedience on October 11th and 12th next year. So mark your calendars. And there will be some sessions on Gandhi and some sessions on Arendt and Martin Luther King and his 50th anniversary of his assassination. But without further ado, let's get today going, and please welcome Uday Mehta.
Thank you, Roger. I'm always happy to be here. This is, of all the conferences I attend, this is always the most interesting, and interesting in part because it is also one in which, where one ends up, the issues that get discussed are never fully scripted. Now, I'll speak very briefly. What I want to think aloud about is obviously the issue of liberal democracy being in crisis. Now, it clearly is in crisis, and when one says it is in crisis, one of the things one means is the sort of governments that have been elected or nearly elected in Western and Eastern Europe, in the United States, in my own country, India, in Turkey. And the reason why these elections invoke the idea of crisis is fairly straightforward. One has seen the rise of authoritarian leaders, the abridgment of rights, the weakening of legislatures, the reassertion of certain forms of identity, such as race and religion. And plainly, all of this suggests some kind of crisis. And it's a crisis that makes us worry about liberal democracy. But the question I want to consider is slightly different. And that is liberal democracy not just in crisis, but itself part of the crisis? That is, does it in fact contribute to the crisis? Because if it is part of the crisis, then we have to think not just in terms of securing liberal democracy, but also changing it. And perhaps when it is changed, we may need another term for this new entity. That is the question that I want to consider. And alas, I'm not sure I have any good answers to offer in response to this question, but still I think the question is worth asking. I ask this question because I think the crisis of our times is not just that the wrong side won, or nearly won, but perhaps something deeper. And to address that deeper matter, we may have to think not just in terms of the next set of elections, but rather in terms of the very mode in which we understand and conceive of politics. So that's broadly my concern. Now, from ancient times, democracy was typically associated with excess, with lawlessness, with spontaneity, and with the people's ability to unsettle regimes of power. This was broadly the view held about democracy by people like Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Polybius. And as it turns out, it was equally the view held about democracy by people like Madison and his fellow Federalists. Now, the response to this fear about the people was in general something we call constitutionalism. And the idea basically was of girding democracy to a particular structure or to particular structures which specified in advance the conditions for the production, distribution, and management of power. Conditions such as the separation of powers, the articulation of rights, the preference, as Roger said yesterday, or the reliance on things like expert knowledge, and the idea that power stemmed from something we call the we of the people, that idea of sovereignty. Now, the basic idea, the basic identity was, or the basic thought here, was that the conjunction of power, of democracy and constitutionalism would produce a particular form of power that would, as it were, contain democracy, because in itself there was something, as I said, excessive about democracy. Now, somebody as distinguished and as important to liberal democracy as James Madison himself expresses this. And I want to quote something from Federalist number 55, where Madison says, "Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob." So the idea is that even if everyone in Athens was as deliberative and as intelligent and as thoughtful as a Socrates, without these structures of power, you would still end up with just a mob. Okay? And this is part of what creates the specific anxiety that Madison and his fellow Federalists is responding to. The anxiety that democracies can only of themselves produce mobs, unless there is some way in which this power is further constituted, okay? Unless in some way the power of the people is in some sense managed or given a certain prior form. Now, the hugely influential tradition of constitutional democracy that Madison and his fellow Federalists spawned, especially influential in countries where constitutional traditions were new and fragile, sought to domesticate and stabilize a form of collective and individual behavior in two ways. First, by making it the currency of political legitimacy, and thereby giving it political credence, and second, by simultaneously blunting its eruptive potential, the eruptive potential of the people. This manner of public life was committed to certain forms of expression and action enclosed within institutional dynamics that normalized the practice of democracy. It professed the importance of stability, order, a methodical ability to respond to changing needs, a flexible mechanism for inclusion and accountability, and the promise of delivering on the demands of justice. Constitutional democracy was and remains in many ways suspicious and condemnatory of practices whose form cannot be anticipated, either because they are willfully or by their very nature episodic, provisional, improvisatory, and indifferent to normal rules of politics and the spaces designated for its exercise. Constitutional democracy is made anxious by demands that fall outside the framework of representation, both when the demand is not articulated within the context of representational channels and when the demand does not represent social groups and classes. Constitutional democracy, notwithstanding its professed championing of the individual, has in many ways relied on the individual as articulating him or herself as the bearer of a social identity, be it a class or a caste, and the mediatory role of the state that is often suspended in the contemporary practice of democracy. The Indian government, the country from which I come, for example, was plainly flummoxed during recent anti-corruption agitations by the fact that the movement had no distinct social, economic, or partisan identity. In representing, quote-unquote, every stripe, the movement largely inadvertently challenged the very basis of constitutional and democratic representation. There was similarly a puzzlement some years ago following the brutal rape of a young woman in Delhi. The massive and sustained public response brought together women and men of virtually every social and economic description. By its undefined constituency, intensity, and size, this mass action shattered the presumption of the matter being, quote unquote, only a woman's issue, or a threat posed by a large immigrant and transient labor force in New Delhi. In a strange way, by refusing to identify a potential victim, the perpetrator, victim and perpetrator with specific bodies, the protest following the rape articulated security as an abstract ethical ideal and not as a political value. Similarly, constitutional democracy is unsettled and baffled by public action that makes no demands or offers up no interest to be negotiated within the extant framework of the social and political contract. This was a conspicuous aspect of the puzzlement and anxiety in the face of the Occupy movement, where the very absence of a demand, indeed the absence even of the absence of precisely designating an adversary, compounded by the improvisational, evanescent, and leaderless form of to which the occupation aspired, led to the characterization of Occupy as a virus by the Wall Street Journal. Now, a virus is an odd metaphor with which to designate something as inescapably obvious as the Occupy movement was. One of the things that plainly informed this anxiety was that there was no clear image corresponding to the normalization of this form of action. How could collective actions collective actions that occurred in plain sight, indeed in the shadow of the most iconic marketplace in the world, be deemed to be invisible or virus-like? Now, the anxiety, and I think the hope underlying the question I'm asking is that of democracy having broken out of the bounds of its constitutional housing. It is a vision of democracy that is inherently and in some instances self-consciously unstable, often indifferent and even resistant to its institutionalization within the legal framework of a polity. It is not clear that it aspires to any fixed form. The linkages that sustain it tend to be horizontal and not hierarchical. It eschews much of the traditional lexicon of political and democratic theory. Terms such as law, sovereignty, class, institutions, leaders, parties, and experts. In many instances, there is a blanket disenchantment with politics itself. So, let me, now, whether liberal democracies can accommodate to such forms of disruptive, non-routinized, epic, and anarchic behavior, or instead whether the abstract ideal of openness and freedom that inspires them will ultimately collapse onto itself due to a lack of supportive scaffolding, is an open and vexing question, one that understandably provokes anxiety, but to a certain extent may also provoke or inspire promise. So let me conclude with giving you 4 questions which for me are important. And here are the questions. First, is there a model of democracy that is not dependent on high economic growth rates and the typically inegalitarian consequences that it produces, not just in society, but also the typically unfortunate and difficult consequences it produces for the environment, especially in countries like the US, where there is a kind of privileged link between capitalism and democracy, rather than a link between democracy and social democracy? So that's the first question. I mean, can one have a form of democracy that is not dependent on high growth rates? Yasha Monk was talking about this, that the stability of democracies seem to have, at least in the past, presumed on high growth rates. And my question is simply, what if we can't have those kind of growth rates? Do we have a form of democracy that can respond to that predicament? Second, is there a model of democracy in which power is genuinely decentralized with all the uncertainty that that is likely to produce? Third, is there a model of democracy that is not dependent on the unitary power of the people to feel utterly safe and secure by having at their disposal the ready power to wage war on others and to secure their own interests? This again draws on what was said yesterday, that in some sense the model of democracy that we have, or of liberal democracy that we have, is in some sense implicitly dependent on the ability to wage war, to wage and win wars. And finally, is there a model of democracy that is not dependent on the words that are common to both the first words of the Indian Constitution and the American Constitution, which are, or the first three words, which are "we the people," but a form of democracy that can imagine itself in with a more modest self-conception that might go as "we the peoples." Now, I don't know the answers to these questions, but what I do know is that in some sense these questions trouble me more than the question about if the wrong side wins the next election. Thank you.